A very good afternoon to our audience and panel speakers. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to the first of our two-part series, ESG Uncovered, Regulation is Coming to End, Greenwashing, Is Your Business Ready? Hosted in partnership with S&P Global. I am Megan C., EcoBusiness's Director of Partnership. We're Asia Pacific's leading media and business intelligence organization dedicated to sustainable development and responsible business. Much progress has been made within the ESG and sustainability space in Asia Pacific and globally since we first established ourselves in 2009 as a go-to platform for news and development on these issues. In what was previously exclusively within the NGO sphere, we're seeing more and more businesses acknowledge their environmental, social, and good governance responsibilities aside from pure profit maximization. We're seeing these agendas dominating both the public and private space as both sectors seek to find solutions to what we now know is a global emergency. For us at EcoBusiness, our role is evolving as well, and we take it upon ourselves to move the needle on climate action conversations. From our early beginnings as an independent journalistic platform, today, we are proud to be the leading voice on sustainable development, bringing together global policy makers, business leaders, academics, and civic society on the key issues that we need to work on together to address this climate crisis. As such, we are proud to be hosting this important dialogue today together with S&P Global as part of our ongoing efforts to cover pertinent sustainability topics across the region. You may have come across the feature series ESG Uncovered on our platform, which we developed in partnership with S&P Global. The aim of this series was to deep dive into the state of sustainable investing and responsible business in Asia, with one of the stories exploring just how real are corporate decarbonization goals. With the increasing spotlight on sustainability and climate change, global business leaders want to establish themselves as sustainability champions by setting aggressive climate and net zero targets, which has drawn concern from regulators, investors, and consumers about greenwashing, unsubstantiated environmental claims made by businesses who seek to persuade the public that their products and policies are environmentally conscious. Fears about greenwashing are, however, accelerating action by global organizations and regulators to establish more consistent setups of ESG disclosures. Initiatives such as the International Sustainability Standards Board that was announced during COP26, a body that will develop a single framework that regulators globally can use to set sustainability disclosure rules, and the CFA Institute's Global ESG Disclosure Standard for investment products are welcomed, although harmonization of these standards are quite some way off. As such, in today's context, where fears about greenwashing are becoming more significant, what does the future hold for Asian businesses as disclosure frameworks are being applied in key Asian markets and as the region starts to get tougher on greenwashing? How can businesses prepare for the increasing but impending scrutiny into their ESG credentials? I may not yet have the answer, but together with my colleague Gillian Parker, we are pleased to bring together some of the region's most critical thinkers to discuss these important questions, and we hope that this important conversation will help guide Asian businesses as they prepare for the implementation of ESG regulations. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope this session serves its purpose in shaping a better understanding of the path ahead. Gillian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan, and good afternoon to our listeners as well. I'd like to introduce our panel today. Andrew Bouet, Vice President of Group's Corporate Sustainability at Singtel and Optus. We also have Eric Lim, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at UOB, and Michael Salvatico, Head of APEC ESG Solutions at S&P Global Sustainable One. Welcome everyone today, and thank you so much for joining our discussion. I'm Gillian, I'll be moderating the panel discussion today. So I hope everyone can hear me okay and see me. So I think we'll begin with Michael, actually. We see greenwashing being bandied around in the press and in the media quite a lot. It's definitely a buzzword as far as we're concerned, but it seems to present itself or manifest itself in an array of products and services. What are some of the drivers of this issue? And is there an industry that's particularly guilty of it?
Thanks, Gillian, and it's a pleasure to be here and to start with such an all-encompassing question, one that is a topic that's raised in many of the discussions that I have with, whether it's with investors, whether it's with banks or corporates themselves. Regulators are concerned about this. And we're seeing, globally a focus on being able to clearly identify what a green investment is. And maybe that's key to what is driving a focus on green investment. But let me take a step back, I suppose, and give people some perspective on, where S&P sits in this discussion, because S&P is helping all of those different organisations that I just mentioned then, and more. Can't leave the academics out because they're a very important part of generating future thinking in ESG and sustainability. But we're really working with all those organisations across all the different facets of understanding their financial as well as their sustainability aspects. And I make that differentiation because I think there's still this view that there's an intangible value that's not necessarily captured directly in the short-term financials, that's captured in the longer-term sustainable profitability of a company. And so once you start to picture that and think about it from the perspective of a company whose operations are then being measured through the lens of more than just the balance sheet, profit and loss and cash flow. And that's happening more and more. And the people on this call are on this call because they're stakeholders or they're involved somehow. They have an interest in a company's sustainability profile. And these companies are now looking to, one, differentiate themselves, but two, also to meet the needs of these stakeholders, the demands. And I might also add there that these companies are looking at improving their sustainability to access new markets, to potentially access capital, and we'll hear more about that on this call. And as well as that view on long-term profitability. So there's all of these aspects of sustainability that are attractive to a company. And we've seen in a very short space of time a rapid adoption of sustainable practices. Companies saying, we're sustainable, we have these initiatives, these policies, or we're doing this. And so in that rush to demonstrate sustainability, there's been a number of different approaches. And in those different approaches, some are being called out as less real in achieving or correctly measuring the outcomes of a company. Now, you notice that I'm taking an angle here which isn't necessarily reflecting everyone, or greenwashing as something that somebody does on purpose to intentionally mislead stakeholders. It can also happen through the company's desire to do the right thing, but looking at the not best practice. What's the word for not best practice? Looking at ways which are not representative of the best possible way a company could measure one of the metrics that are being assessed. And I think about that as more green wishing, I suppose, than green washing, a term that was raised in a panel that I attended recently. So there's this desire to demonstrate greenness. Now, you say, is there a particular industry that you could call out? I don't think so. I don't think there's any one particular industry. I'm sure there's people in the audience who would want to point to the fossil fuel industry or the oil and gas industry as having, potentially having greater incentive to demonstrate a green behaviour or sustainable behaviour that wasn't necessarily true. But in I suppose balancing that is that they're under a greater lens of scrutiny. So what they do needs to actually represent real change and real drivers. There's also, when you think about greenwashing as a term, it's not just what the company is doing and what the company is reporting, but it's also how that's being demonstrated in how investments. So investors are looking at these companies, bringing these companies together, and then promoting their investment vehicles as being sustainable based on metrics that they might call out. This is a Paris-aligned investment, for instance, or this this particular investment has low risk of a physical risk event affecting it materially. These things might be claims that a fund might make. And again, I look at those and I think about it more in a positive lens, that it's not, I give the benefit of the doubt to the investor. It's not necessarily that they're looking to mislead investors, but they're potentially using sources of information that aren't reflecting best practice. And without wanting to keep the floor for too long in the first question, so much to say in such a broad comment there, Gillian. Some of the things that we look at are helping both companies and both investors to better measure their sustainability profile. And those tools exist through data, through reporting services that we provide to corporates and financial institutions, but it's also in our analysis of their credit risk, where we're looking at their ESG exposures through the factor of a credit rating and deep dive analysis. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully, in that, it's a big question to tackle
Yes.
in one go, but hopefully that gives more perspective for the rest of the panel.
Yeah, no, that's great, Michael. I think you've touched on some really key points there. And I think we're seeing that as well. It's not always an intentional, deliberate move to be greenwashing necessarily, but it certainly does pose a reputational risk for businesses that are maybe caught doing it. But so you touched on data, actually, which is something maybe actually Andrew and Eric can both allude to a little bit about how we can use data to really bring greater transparency and really sort of find out, what is the data and how can it help prevent some of these issues cropping up. Perhaps Andrew, you'd like to start with that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. Well, data and analytics and AI and technology is definitely one of the means and enablers, to try and keep greenwashing at bay in a sense, because it gives you a lot more comparability. You can follow trends, you can do a lot more benchmarking. But obviously today, a lot of the data and the AI still comes from data that the company discloses, right? So you could have a rubbish in, rubbish out type situation even with the AI. But I do see that as one of the tools and one of the means, albeit not the only. I think, if you think of what a corporate needs to do, and I'll speak about it a bit later, to try and address this issue of greenwashing. Actually, there's no silver bullet. You've got to cover quite a lot of stuff. And I think one of the biggest things from a corporate perspective, if you look at it, is just good sheer corporate governance and even things like assurance that they undertake, which is normal business practice that actually does try and prevent some of these issues. Because sometimes board are not even aware of the details of what disclosures and claims are being made, right? And so that becomes a challenge. But definitely data is an emerging area that's being leveraged quite significantly. And also, I think once you get into the broader complexity of not just the company operations, but into supply chain with your suppliers, which is where ESG issues sometimes do happen, then data and analytics and tools also do come into the picture quite significantly.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We'll get back to the supply chain issue. Eric, you're in the financial institutions, so I guess there's lots of data going around, but how do we ensure that it's purposeful and useful?
Yeah, so when we think about sustainability, I really want to kind of echo something Michael said, which is there's a lot of enthusiasm at this point in time, sustainability being a mega trend. Everybody wants to do the right thing or ride that opportunity wave, right? And so I think when we talk about greenwashing, there tends to be 2 or 3 types of different flavors. And I think Michael brought out the flavor, which is, call it over enthusiasm without enough real technical expertise, right? And standards. There is still an edge where certain industries, certain players know that perhaps they are in more challenge type situations and business models. And therefore, there is a temptation almost to talk a greener game than they actually are doing. And we have to recognize that there are players like that as well. And that's where, coming back to your question, Gillian, around data and around standards, this becomes really important. Because as we look across the modern economy and how we've got to be able to navigate this big, giant Titanic of economy that's been built on fossil fuels towards net zero, every industry is going to have to transform themselves in unique ways, right? Be it power generation, be it transportation, be it financial services. And each industry is going to have a different set of pathways, different set of technologies, different solutions. And having the right data that can allow us as financial institutions or investors or the public at large to be able to assess the level of progress around these specific industries becomes critically important, right? And this is where we can see that certain sectors are ahead in the game. Because if you look at the built environment, right, real estate or power generation, collecting scope 1, 2, 3 or emissions data is already quite an established capability. It's much easier to access high quality, granular, credible data to be able to understand how we're doing. And then you start getting into business models that get increasingly complex. For example, nature-based type business models, right? Agriculture, where you have conflicting effects, right? And the ability to then set clear standards around what KPIs are. Number two, to be able to build those measurement systems to collect that data. Therefore, then to be able to build the right pathways, that's critically important. So I think around this data topic, it's very clear what gets measured gets done, right? And it is a very different state of play depending on which part of the industry we're looking at right now.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Again, touched on lots of points there. Andrew, actually, I just wanted to go back to your supply chain issue, and I think both Eric and Michael can chime in on this as well. But I mean, we've done actually quite a lot of our intelligence arm has done a lot of research into the impact of data centers, for instance, and we know that that's a very big issue here in Singapore. So we know that about some of the issues around the telco space in terms of carbon emissions, which seems like a very in a lot of ways measurable factors, but what are we not thinking about? Perhaps drawing more attention to the S in ESG, the social factor, which is not exactly the easiest. We speak to lots of businesses at EcoBusiness. It's not the easiest factor to measure. What are you doing at Singtel to look closely at the social aspect of ESG and to eradicate some of those more stubborn issues?
Thanks, Gillian, for that question. It's quite interesting when I came out from the business to take on this sustainability role. Initially, while a lot of sustainability is associated with the environmental aspects, actually, initially, a lot of the focus was on what we call the social element, because we don't use social in the context of just the community. But the moment you talk about social, there are at least a couple of other elements. One is the customer being part of that social ecosystem. And for our telco sector, where things like cybersecurity and data privacy, data protection is such a major issue, that's definitely one of our top material issue for the ICT and the telco industry, right? So that's just one angle. Then you have a second angle from social, which is a bit more community and our customer focus, which is, we are dealing with what we call the unintended consequences of our industry. For example, when you talk about device addiction and social media addiction and cyberbullying and things like that, these are actually some of the social type issues that, even though the nature of our business does not intend to create those problems, they are what we call the unintended consequences. So as a company, we've always had to be quite proactive in how we address it through digital citizenship programs that we run across the region, not just in Singapore, to address some of these risks with our customers. And then I think a third example of the social, which in a sense actually Asia should be putting a lot of attention, is the whole human rights issue, especially in the supply chain. And while today there's so much focus on the environmental, I do feel especially a lot of supply chains are in Asia. They are in countries that labor laws and human rights laws and legislation is not very clear. I do see that as a very big area that actually corporates need to start paying attention to. Not that they need to be based here, but as long as your supply chain touches Asia, you're already deemed as a bit of a high risk. And that's a fairly complex thing to deal with, because you're not just dealing with your direct suppliers, but multi-tiers within the supply chain. In fact, that's something even at Singtel, we are still very early in the journey, because we're dealing with 7,000 direct suppliers, let alone 4 or 5 layers, and you're talking about tens of thousands of indirect suppliers, where slowly, how do we get a grasp of all this social as well as the environmental issues within our sort of value chain?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Michael, I wonder if you've got anything to add to that, because I'm sure this is a burning question for lots of companies where, maybe some of these supply chains are slightly out of sight, out of mind, but again, pose quite a grave reputational risk to any business that, goes awry.
Reputational risk that's increasingly under the focus, under the microscope, if you like, of stakeholders. Whereas if you go back a couple of years when we talked about ESG, it was really within the operations of an organisation. But now there's even legislation that requires reporting through the supply chain, such as in Australia, where modern slavery is a legislation that needs to be assessed at an organisation of a certain size. And one of the quotes that I recently heard was, if you don't find modern slavery in your supply chain, you're not looking hard enough. A lot of the supply chains come back through Asia, and modern slavery is capturing a lot of the issues there. So that's just one example. And you think about what Andrew says. There's 7,000 direct suppliers, and that's a huge number. And in a way, as a sustainability focused research house, we're looking at this, and we're hearing on one side that we've got stakeholders, whether it's investors or banks, regulators, who are more and more interested in what's going on through that supply chain. That puts a lot of pressure on Andrew to understand better what's going on through the organisation. And so some of the ways that we're finding that companies are coming to us is to ask for ways to collect information from those suppliers. And so we're looking at solutions like ESG repositories that allow suppliers to self-serve in terms of putting information in, and then give Andrew an enormous database. And I'm using Andrew as an example here. This isn't work that we're doing with him. I've got a highlight here is for people on this call. This is purely hypothetical, but there are companies that potentially. I'm walking myself into a trap here, Andrew. Sorry for calling out your name. Let me just say more generally that there are companies that we do work with, and case studies that we do have. We're working with organisations that have thousands of suppliers, and they've taken this route where they can then analyse their suppliers' ESG. And then it comes back to that concept of rubbish in, rubbish out. I think that's a really good comment, and I can call Andrew out for making that because that's true. And essentially, if companies are reporting rubbish, then it's being picked up. It's being picked up by organisations such as ourselves, which have quality controls that look at companies and assess it against their peers, and very sophisticated analysis, not just averages across peer groups, but analysing companies and saying, right, a company of this size in this industry with operations in this country, that if a company reports a very low fatalities, for instance, it's picked up by an organisation potentially through that Q&A. But at the same time, if companies aren't reporting, then they're doing themselves a disservice. They're doing themselves a disservice because if they're not reporting, then it's being calculated on their behalf. And so this is something that I think is really important. And though organisations such as S&P are very sophisticated in that modelling, we've been doing it for 20 years, right? Environmental impacts, we can calculate through the value chain, the water, waste, pollution, direct cost. We did this for an organisation in the US, Greenbiz, and found out that there was $5 trillion of these natural capital costs sitting in the largest 1,200 companies. But so, what I'm saying here is if companies aren't telling their story, then somebody else is telling it for them, and that's us. So, I can see Andrew nodding here. I'm sure that you get stakeholders knocking on your door. And you guys are good on the reporting side. I also just wanted to, Gillian, just come back to data, and you might be getting to this, but just want to flag things like there are measures for companies. There are measures that analyse their reporting and assess it against greenwashing hurdles, if you like. So, and same for their investments in activities like the EU taxonomy. And the EU taxonomy is wrapped up to investors in sustainable financial disclosure reporting. So, there are ways that are becoming common and standardized. And if I harp on one thing on this call, it really is that standardization, transparency and impact. And these are the thoughts that investors have in their mind when they're looking at companies and thinking how to distinguish greenwashing companies from companies that are really reporting.
I think standardization is something that we're still hoping for, but Eric, I'm going to actually direct that question to you because there are lots of providers, there's lots of methods. I mean, we could probably all list at least half a dozen acronyms that different companies are using for different things. It can be quite difficult sometimes to draw meaning from some of those ESG rankings with reports of mislabeled funds, really undermining the trust of the institutional investor and of course, like me, retail investor. What are some of the checks and balances that financial institutions are putting in place to guard against greenwashing and ESG funds? What are the sort of things that you're doing?
Yeah, Gillian, that's a really good point. The whole alphabet soup of disclosure standards, sustainability frameworks, it is quite traumatic for anyone who's in the space, right? And so when you think about what financial services does, especially, we bank the entire economy. So any framework that's relevant to financial services and any economy we bank suddenly is part of the alphabet soup as well. So from our standpoint, it's very clear that we need to be able to use frameworks that sustainability investors, regulators, as well as interested parties recognize. So you get the standard, your GRIs, your SASBs, your TCFDs, right, CDPs, et cetera, right? And as we begin to extend green or sustainable financing or investments in support of sustainable assets or companies, we're very cognizant of the fact, Michael mentioned the whole EU taxonomy piece, is these assets that we generate need to be recognizable and investable by investors in EU as well as in the US, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about UOB, my customer base is in Singapore and ASEAN and North Asia, but the capital markets we tap are in Europe, in the US. My investors, institutional investors, are also in those more sophisticated spaces. So it's very important, therefore, when you talk about standards harmonization, that we are talking about a set of global standards that can be applied and recognized across the entire globe, right? That is not enough, because just saying you're using the right standards, who's to believe you? And that's where we have to work with the SPO providers or second party opinion providers. We have to work with assurance firms. For example, we just got our sustainability report externally assured this year, right? And by working with ecosystem partners who are able to provide you that SPO or assurance confidence, you can then go to market with even greater confidence, right? And when I think about some of the work like what ISSB is doing to try to bring all of these frameworks, hopefully under a single umbrella, and understand how they kind of relate to each other, to be able to link up financial versus non-financial information. This is the kind of innovation and evolution to disclosure standards that the market will need. Because at the end of the day, what we need to be able to do is piece together the entire ecosystem of the economy with financial flows, with regulators, with exchanges, so that increasingly everybody's speaking to a consistent set of language, a consistent set of data. And that's how we can ensure that we don't get arbitrage or gaping holes in terms of this journey towards a sustainable future.
So do you believe that the formation of the ISSB, for instance, will reduce that variability that we're seeing among ESG ratings, for example?
I think it allows for a forum to have that conversation and a forum to be able to resolve where those overlaps or missing gaps are. Because if you think about what existed before the ISSB, were all of these frameworks that were standing up, some of them more focused on social, some more environmental, some were more popular with investors, some were more popular with regulators, some were more, kind of self-regulated. And it was too much of a landscape of different frameworks, all trying to do good things, that was making it extremely difficult for reporting organizations like Andrew and mine to be able to understand what to respond to. And you can imagine if large corps like us are struggling with the alphabet soup of sustainability frameworks and disclosures, God help small and medium enterprises. And if we can crack that part of the economy, we're never going to get there. So part of this ISSB coming together, being almost this platform where we can debate what is the common language, and to have that forum to continue to evolve and refine disclosure standards is not only going to help folks like Andrew and myself, it's really going to help our smaller customers get into the same framework and same kind of language as well.
Thank you, Eric. Andrew, we've spoken before about the importance of science-based targets. Maybe you could touch on that a little bit in the context of Syntel and the telco industry.
Thanks, Julian. I think science-based targets is, just one of the means, I would say. If you look at a whole myriad of tools or approaches or frameworks that you can use to try and avoid this issue or risk of misrepresentation or inaccurate information or a lack of comparability, right? So when we were looking at our emissions reduction targets, it's quite easy to pluck from the air and put a number there. But we were one of the early adopters, in fact, the first corporate in the Asia Pacific outside of Japan to use the science-based targets for emissions target setting and have that approved by SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative. And why those are important? Because actually, once you get into the environmental space, that was mentioned earlier by one of the panelists, in the environmental space, you have a lot more data, and especially in the climate space, there's a lot more data, there's a lot more science, there's a lot more global data modeling. And again, you're also dealing with an issue that is a global issue. I can talk about all the great things we do, but does that add up to a contribution at a global level to reduce emissions? It's very hard to say whether it's really contributing from a cause and effect. So when the SBTI framework came out, we found it as a very good opportunity. It wasn't easy because, again, it's a new tool, it's a new framework, but we found that it did guide us how we went about it. And of course, there's a lot of work to be done even after you've set the target. So it's definitely one of the tools that is critical. And of course, now beyond our initial scope 1 and scope 2, what we've also done this year is we've just completed a full 15, we call it the 15 category scope 3 analysis for our whole, supply chain, customer emissions, etc. And again, linking it back to the science and the data behind all your scope 3 emissions, that's going to be quite critical as we now develop our strategy and the roadmap to get to a net zero position, right? So we've made a commitment, we work towards a net zero position, but actually the work is just starting in the whole scope 3, even while we put initially quite a bit of focus on emissions reduction in the scope 1 as well as the scope 2 area.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Now, Michael, I'm sure you're asked, where do we begin with this alphabet soup? I mean, it's even as journalists, it's confusing keeping track of where all this is going and who's doing what and which is the best one to use. How do you advise people?
It's an alphabet soup, and look, I accept that term. I mean, I don't want to be defensive, having worked in sustainability for 12 years. I think alphabet soup is, I think it's a fair label to give any industry. I mean, look at standard banking. If you went and spoke to somebody in the food industry, I'm sure that they'd have a gazillion acronyms. I was speaking to a consultant yesterday who was using SME in a way that I've never heard before. They were using it instead of small to medium enterprise. They were saying a specialist, a specialist in a particular area. It's not what SME stands for.
Subject matter expert.
Subject matter expert, Eric, thank you. And I'm just like, okay, you've got your own acronyms, I like that. And look, ESG's growing up, I suppose, and it's become more important, and it does really touch every part of the economy. I like that Andrew again calls out just that climate change has taken a really big focus. I think we really need to have. I mean, I want to contribute to that comment as well. I totally agree. Coming from a finance background, into sustainability, it makes sense. Climate change makes sense because it's a number. We know what we need to do. We know when we need to achieve it. 45% emissions reductions by 2030. We've got a date. We've got an amount. We can allocate that amount to companies today. We know what the trajectories look like to get there. Those trajectories can be determined by scientific-based methods, science-based targets. I mean, well done, Singtel for using SBT. It's an initiative that I feel has a great place to play in helping establish that, look, science was there to point out climate change was an issue. It should be a scientific approach that's used to determine the trajectories of companies that are achieving Paris alignment. We use that approach too. So we use the sectorial decarbonisation approach where it's appropriate. That was supported by SBT, now by other initiatives, the big financial and investor-backed initiatives around the world, as the most specific assessment for trajectories. It looks at product level, right? And I was speaking to a steel manufacturer on a panel not so long ago who also uses that approach. And that proved the point that I had been making for a long time, that it's using a consistent approach between a provider such as ourselves, which is applying this analysis to 15,000 companies and then giving it to investors to aggregate up. What I'm saying to the investors is, that by using this, you're using a common or consistent approach to companies, which makes that engagement so much more powerful and leads to results. Right, rather than using sophisticated integrated assessment models which have a gazillion assumptions that companies can pull out and say, maybe that's not how we see the world. And believe me, that does happen. I call out the report that I did for IGCC again. Think of that, 32 companies, 35 different ways that they approach their scenario analysis. Makes it very challenging from a consistency perspective. So there's definitely that focus on science-based targets. S&P Global has a science-based target. We've committed to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2040. And one of the things that I want to call out there is we also committed to reducing the emissions of our supply chain, right? A large part of our supply chain, 25% by 2025. So this is not just about the organisation. This is about the supply chain. Again, we're a stakeholder that's reaching out to the supply chain and looking at them. And, just like we do when we call out our first tier assessment in our extended scope 2 analysis, we say to our clients, you've been thinking about scope 2 for a long time as just the energy you bring into your organization. But really, you're making choices about a lot of other first tier suppliers. And you've been making those choices on reliability, quality, cost, relationships. Soon that decision-making process is going to include their climate impact on your organization, right? The emissions that you inherit as an organization when you have a relationship buying from that company. So that's a long way to say I think that SBT is another acronym that goes into that soup. I don't think that soup is going to have less letters in it anytime soon. I think we're still right at the beginning. No one had even heard of net zero, really, 2 years ago, right? Now net zero is supported by an enormous number of organizations. I heard a number of around 5,000. 90% of global GDP has a net zero target. So I'm sitting here in Sydney listening to an election that's about to take place, thinking, Liberal Labor. Actually, it doesn't matter, guys. Whether we have a net zero target here that's leading to, short-term targets that we achieve or not, Australia is going to be dealing with trade partners who are going to be doing the same thing that I said companies will do, right? Those trade partners will be going, really nice to deal with Australia, but I'm actually thinking about the carbon intensity of the relationship because it's affecting my net zero targets and commitments.
I think, Gillian, just to add to what Michael mentioned, I think it's again back to the question of this alphabet soup. And I often get approached by peers, especially who are new to the sustainability sector and trying to make choices on the alphabet soup and what standards, etc. And my advice is always just start somewhere, because even while many of the standards have their nuances and differences, they all are built off some core fundamental commonalities. So even from a reporting perspective, as we started with GRI, and then later as we engage a bit more with our US investors, a lot more were using SASB. So we incorporated and built on some of the SASB standards. When TCFD came about in around 2017, it's only a high level framework. And we said, look, we could either wait for it to finalize, or we could sort of get into it, understand, apply it, learn as it is developing. You actually get there a lot faster, and you understand, and it drives a lot of insights, even if some of these standards are emerging. So don't get into what I call the analysis paralysis, or which tool, which framework, which standard, because most of the global ones actually have some foundations, and they are fairly strong foundations. And then it's really how do you build the incremental understanding and disclosures over time. That would be my advice for the alphabet soup discussion.
But it does sound like companies are making much greater efforts to engage with their suppliers and just have a much better oversight into the people that are feeding services into their own organization. And that's sort of been touched on as a sort of one of the key things to be looking at to guard against this greenwashing issue. I'm just wondering, how then do we ensure, and I'd love to hear from all of you on this, how then do we ensure that the ESG efforts as a business, the sustainability roadmap that we have is genuine, is authentic, that we're just not paying lip service to CSR and sort of saying, yes, we agree with these great tenets and these great ideas, we're actually putting it into practice. Eric, I'll start with that big question for you.
Yeah, thanks. I think the first word that will keep businesses true is this concept of authenticity to the business model itself, right? And I think when folks, to Andrew's point, get kind of caught up in the whole bigness of sustainability, it can get quite confusing. But if business owners, boards of businesses just kind of step back and say, what is my business model, right? What do I do in terms of interaction with my community, my business supply chain, my vendors, my clients, and understand the implications of sustainability within that core value chain, products and services? I think that's a great way to start thinking about sustainability, right? So take a bank, for example. We're clearly an allocator of capital and liquidity into the main economy. And so when we think about sustainability, it's very clear that we support our clients by financing their sustainability journeys, right? And so where we can give green and sustainable financing to help our clients transform their business models to be more sustainable, or to build assets for the new economy that are, net zero or emissions free, that's our contribution, right? And it's true to our business model, and it's true to the environmental or social impact. So I think authenticity to the business model is the first most important thing, right? And then the second bit is, especially for small and medium enterprises where you can't crack everything out at the same shot or at the same time, is to be able to then look for the signals within your ecosystem or stakeholder groups. And the key ones will obviously be your clients, your regulatory bodies, right, within your national jurisdictions, your financiers, right, and your supply chain, to see where your key stakeholders are playing more emphasis on. And we can clearly tell right now there is a lot of focus on the environment, right? Therefore, being able to take your business model, take the focus areas from your stakeholders, combine those two lenses together to say, for example, what is the emissions profile, right, of how I deliver my products and services? What is the emissions profile of my value chain through the whole scope 1, 2, and 3 a lens of the world? And how do I articulate a baseline from which I can improve? I think that's the easiest way to keep a sustainability roadmap or implementation as true as possible. And I really agree with what Andrew says. It's important not to boil the whole ocean all at the same time, because the 80-20 rule applies to everything in that, right? There will be 20% of things that we can focus on and control that will generate 80% of the impact and the value that we can offer back to our communities and economies. So I think an authentic way of going about that is going to help all of our stakeholders be able to look at us and say, you may not be perfect, but at least you're doing your best and you're definitely not greenwashing.
Yeah, that's sound advice. Andrew, I'll direct that same question to you.
Yeah, just two comments to build on what Eric mentioned. I think if you really engage the stakeholders and you align on what are material issues between yourself and the stakeholders, and you take a stakeholder lens to everything that you do and how you're trying to address and communicate that, I think it actually is an important formula for getting organizations out of this quandary of unauthenticity or misrepresentation, etc. Because once you do all these direct stakeholder engagement, you actually go into a lot more detail that there's no way you can talk fluff and tell a fluffy story because you're going into details. And that's what we found, as we engage a lot deeper with investors, they want to know the questions they ask, the data they ask for, the probing they do. No way a corporate can stand up to that level of detail, scrutiny, and stakeholder engagement if they don't have the substance, authenticity, and the evidence behind that in that sense, right? So I'll say stakeholder engagement and focusing on the material areas, I think, is actually quite critical. Just one other interesting lens. It's quite interesting that the last couple of years, I'll say maybe just the last year or maybe 2 years, especially given the COVID situation, I've engaged a lot of stakeholders who are trying to understand how sustainability links back to the corporate purpose, right? And we recently announced a new corporate purpose for Singtel to empower every generation. But even before that, the engagement to say, look, if you're really driving sustainability, how does that link? What's your corporate purpose beyond just making profits? And I think those sort of conversations have actually driven and brought to life the substance of and importance of corporate purposes. I think especially because the corporate world, the whole world has just gone through 2 years of very fundamental transitions and changes with, all this COVID-related pandemic that everyone, including individuals as well as corporates, have got to go back to what's the core of my purpose, right? And if you think of it, when a corporate purpose is very clear, the corporate purpose is beyond the own corporate performance, etc., then actually sustainability becomes a very natural flow on effect from a company's purpose.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Michael, do you want to add to any of those comments?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I just want to say, thank you, Andrew, for bringing up purpose. I think that's so important. And even beyond an ESG perspective, I hope everyone out there is finding purpose in what they do, because it's clearly evident after 2 years of COVID that's a very important factor to our own satisfaction. I want to add 3 things from different perspectives. Hearing from Eric and Andrew has made me think of it in different ways. So, you talk about working with companies who have ESG or sustainability at their core. I think that's really important, and that's one of the things that we rely on when we look at the corporate sustainability assessment, the CSA. So that's an activity that companies are involved in to provide information. I want to give a bit more of a view on that, but I also want to touch in on how investors should be thinking about this, through using ESG benchmarks and climate change benchmarks. I think this needs to be put on the table. That market cap weighted benchmarks are in fact exposing investors to things that they might, or exposing investors to things that they might not be aligned with their own mandates, investment strategies, and thinking around risks like ESG and climate change. And got some interesting things out there. And the other one was just how to fund these things. So Eric mentioned SPOs, and that's an area that I just wanted to touch on quickly as well. So if I just come back to that CSA, that corporate sustainability assessment, it's an assessment for companies that have sustainability already at the core of their business. And that's what we say when we talk to companies about doing it. Every company in the S&P Global Index is invited to perform that corporate sustainability assessment. It's over 11,000 companies. And it is part of not just collecting information, but part of helping companies have a greater focus on their sustainability strategies, focused on relevant and comprehensive sustainability-focused assessments. And there are 1,000 data points that we're collecting in over 100 different questions. So it's intensive for companies to do this, but the feedback that we get from companies is about how preparing the survey helps them embed sustainability thinking into their corporate DNA, right? It helps them reduce sustainability risks for the company. And because it's an assessment, it really goes beyond what we've seen in the past from ESG ratings, which is looking at disclosure only. And disclosure only, that worked in the time that the ESG ratings existed, 10 years ago, because that's really all there was. Nowadays, corporates have big teams, sustainability teams. They want to tell their stakeholders about what they're doing. And so the corporate sustainability assessment gives them that opportunity to talk about the initiatives they have, which they might not have thought to disclose or disclose in ways that are so evident, that are comparable and standardized in our assessments. And this, in the way of thinking about ESG, I really do feel that I want to share a Wayne Gretzky quote. I don't know if anyone on this call is a great hockey player or fan. I mean, I'm not a hockey player, and yet I know Wayne Gretzky, right? And so, his quote is that a good hockey player plays the puck where it is. A great hockey player plays the puck where it's going to be. And that's the way we think about ESG scoring through the CSA. So the CSA informs our ESG scores. And we have a version for smaller companies, if you like, a CSA that is for private companies as well. So we see that as a big area that companies need to demonstrate their sustainability profile in a way that can then be shared with either stock exchange reporting, regulatory guidance reporting, or other stakeholders. And I mentioned their benchmarks in that call. We really need to also think about how investors are looking at their portfolios, and often hear investors the argument that investors need to look at the whole market, not just an ESG focused lens. Well, I mean, I was a quantitative strategist for Merrill Lynch for 10 years, and it was okay for investors to have value strategies or growth strategies, and essentially that was screening out a large part of the universe. So, I think this is something that also applies to an ESG lens. I'm happy to have that discussion with anybody who thinks otherwise. And the other one's the second party opinions. I mean, Eric, you're so right. It's critical for the credibility of these activities that are being invested through green bonds and social bonds. And that's something that S&P Global's picked up on. And we're providing a second party opinion that goes beyond anything else that I've seen. So very specific around measuring the either the sustainability or greenness of those activities that are being invested in.
Okay, that's good to know. It's interesting. Thank you all. I think we'll move on to some of the questions. We've got a few coming in from our listeners. I'm going to start with this one actually on SMEs in the traditional sense, the small to medium enterprises. We've said that they're actually probably incredibly overwhelmed with the amount of reporting requirements. They maybe don't have the sustainability department that you would see in these larger corporations. So what's your key advice or your sort of 3-step list for SMEs to start preparing for reporting requirements?
Who's that one for, Gillian?
Whoever has an answer. Eric, you can start, because you're probably actually banks are lending to small to medium enterprises. What's the sort of key advice you would give?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts, and it kind of goes back to a couple of the key comments that I shared just now, which is for SMEs, it's very important for them to be very clear about who the biggest stakeholders are, right? And for SMEs, it's going to be the environment in which you operate, which is your national regulatory environment. Number 2, your customer base, your value chain, so what your clients are looking for. And number 3, pay attention to your bankers, because they need to keep feeding you the liquidity, right? So I would say for SMEs, just keep it tight, keep it sharp, what your clients need from you from a sustainability perspective, where your government is going, what your bankers are telling you. Work with them, like Andrew said, just focus on the key needs from these stakeholders, start the journey small, but credibly, and then you can build from there. That's my best advice.
That sounds like excellent advice. Does anyone else want to build on that?
Yeah, can I just add to that without stealing Andrew's thunder? I'll credit Andrew with this one, but just start, like full stop. You know, don't let it stop. And the reason that I jumped in there to say that is because there's a couple of avenues for these small companies to start. As I say, you know, there's approaches for them to use, like an ESG repository or a CSA, a lighter version of the CSA, or an ESG disclosure analysis. So one of the ways that we worked with a company in Australia, for instance, they were looking to list. It was a private company, so you can imagine at that SME level, they wanted to list, and they wanted to be able to demonstrate their sustainability efforts, because they had been practicing sustainable functions throughout their organisation. So we went in and we did a report for them called an ESG disclosure report that looks at the material risks, analyzes the material risks, identifies it for them, and brings together the measurements that they had. That then allows them to go off and to take that to the exchange, because most exchanges across Asia Pac, or most, let me say, 11 exchanges across Asia Pac in particular have sustainability practices either as guidance or even mandatory in their listings. And in the end, that company didn't list; it got acquired by another listed company. So you know, the fact that they had the ESG disclosure report was still an advantage to them, because they were able to demonstrate that to their purchaser, and hopefully, who knows, but I'm just going to guess that allowed them to sell at a higher price.
Okay, thank you.
I think to add to that, the way I would say for SMBs, don't reinvent the wheel, right? You're part of a particular sector, you're maybe part of a particular value chain. And again, because there's so much data out there of what are the material issues for different sectors or in the value chain that you operate, you've already got a very good starting point without needing to reinvent the wheel. That's one. Then the other second example, which I think Eric mentioned, is, for example, if you're a SMB in a value chain where your major corporate purchaser, for example, right, is a leading ESG practitioner, then take the clues from what is important to say that large corporate in terms of their focus and the kind of standards they want to achieve, code of practice, and so forth, because that gives you a clue when a big corporate is going to engage you in your supply chain in your SMB. I'm going to expect those things, right? So I think for SMBs, there's a lot of don't reinvent the wheel, try and leverage as much insights, data that already exists within the sector or the value chain. And the other thing, which I think there's a lot more room to focus on, is a lot of SMBs are part of what I call associations, right? Industry bodies, industry associations. And I do feel there's a better opportunity to approach ESG as a whole sector-based association, which of course comprises many SMBs at the same time, because you tackle many of the same issues without needing to reinvent. And sometimes collectively, that's where you've got that scale of the collective effort in terms of trying to influence outcome or access to data or things like that. Otherwise, if you operate on your own individually, you just lack the scale, you lack the resources.
Thank you. Yes, that's all great answers. And we've got lots of smaller enterprises attending as well, so it's great. Thank you. So this question's just come in from Jordan. Bear with me, I'll read it. My suggestion, given that S is not easy to measure and it's difficult to establish the cause and effect, then a working solution for framework linking financial and non-financial issues should be based on finding common values for all stakeholders in different sectors. What do you think?
I'm not sure that I totally got the question, but one of the last part I got, and that is, when we're looking at companies, you know, consistent with things that have been said, there's definitely an industry focus on material risks, but around 50% of the questions that we ask are consistent across all companies in all industries.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Do you think the single materiality approach of the ISSP defeats the purpose of sustainability reporting? And shouldn't double materiality be the appropriate approach as adopted by the European Union directives and promoted by GRI?
So maybe I can pick this one up. I'm a little confused by the question because I didn't think the ISSB approach was a single materiality approach, right? I mean, if you take a look at what ISSB builds on, it's on TCFD, it's based on SASB, right? And clearly those frameworks are very focused on financial and non-financial. Being able to understand how a business model creates profit, but creates the right E, S, and G type outcomes. So I don't think it's a single materiality approach. In fact, if they build on the foundation that's been already put in place, it will actually bring these very good frameworks in a much more coherent manner and set the standard such that there's less and less reporting arbitrage within industry and across sectors.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Just this question's coming in from the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, there is a law that mandates the country's biggest private electricity distribution company to supply energy at the cheapest cost, regardless of source. So, obviously sitting in Asia, still fossil energy still dominates. Because of that, I am wary that the distribution utility would use S in ESG, responding to their electrification mandate and ensuring that Filipinos have access to electricity, to overshadow their impact on E, GHG emissions from coal burning. So how do you recommend companies in this situation navigate their sustainability journey and reporting?
Maybe just a comment there. I think one of the things we got to bear in mind is, I suppose, you've heard the term the just transition, right? It's well and good for all the advanced countries, advanced corporates to talk about environmental and emissions reduction, etc. But when you get to some of these developing markets, and I used to be the chief operating officer at Globe Telecom in the Philippines, you're talking about basic needs that are not even met, right? So one of the challenge I think we've got to appreciate is, for example, if you're transitioning to a low carbon emissions type scenario in a place like Philippines, where a household is struggling to even get basic electricity, then if you go and look at a different mode of energy delivery, etc., it might be a long time before they even get access to cheap energy. But on the other hand, there might even be what I call leapfrog opportunities, because we did see, for example, certain villages and communities are today coming together to actually put up their own things like their own community solar panels and etc. And they're sort of leapfrogging dirty energy, dirty electricity supply, right? And it doesn't quite answer this question, but I think the world's got to understand there's this element of just transition for both environmental and social issues, and hence why I suppose there's a role the more advanced nations and even corporates got to play in terms of what can we do to help those that are either actually a victim of modernization and a victim of globalization, address it and come up to speed on it, right? I do think that's something we haven't really given a lot of thought of. All of us as corporates are just solving our own problem without thinking what's the other issues and consequences for those in the more developed markets.
Yeah, I really want to kind of echo Andrew's point here. I think it's very important to understand that for a problem of this size, where you're trying to choose between energy access and development versus environment, there are no easy answers, right? So it's not that the politicians don't get sustainability, it's that they've got to balance everything else, and that's a really tough balance. But I do think that as the years go by, when COP26 becomes 27, becomes 28, and the years kind of get used up, there is going to be more and more differentiation between nations that continue to step up their ambition and can show credible national development plans that will bring them much more in line with a net zero future, versus countries that are not doing that hard work. And you're going to end up with a two-state world of countries that figured it out versus increasingly pariah states, right? That will, on an international scene, be subject to more and more pressure internationally. But I think that conversation is necessary because that's also what's going to trigger Andrew's point, which is as the developed nations see where the real challenge versus just dragging our feet comes through, and the world becomes clearer on where the real investments, which countries really need help, because despite their best efforts, they can't get there. That's where you start to see, hopefully, a global reallocation of capital into countries that really need that investment support, because there will be a recognition that we have to bring the entire world along this journey.
Actually, just to add, if you think of where a lot of the carbon offsets are happening, they're actually in developing economies, because you've got a lot of the natural forests there, provided it's not been deforested. So I do see one of the big issues globally. Actually, it comes back to this Article 6 issue that was such a big topic at COP26. In a sense, today, the developing economies, if you take about like Indonesia, Philippines, Indochina, for all the nature-based offset projects that they're doing, actually, they're exporting valuable offsets to the developing market who's prepared to pay. And what's that going to leave? It's going to leave, of course, these are voluntary schemes, so it hasn't yet affected the G2G level. But technically, I think at some stage, governments will even wise up to it, say, like the new concept of neocolonialism, we're actually exporting something that later we're going to be kept accountable for. And this is all the nature-based offsets and reforestation and nature-based offsets and whatever it is. And actually, it's the developed economy and the rich corporates that are just buying all this and leaving none for the local entities or the local countries, right? So I think that's something that we've also got to think about, because it's got to be something that's got to be brought to bear and addressed. Otherwise, you do get a situation where the whole voluntary markets and offset markets, which are so critical in a sense, a lot of corporates are trying to use that as part of the offsetting, could actually collapse if we are not looking at it, what's left and what do we do for the developing markets.
I think it's really crucial, Andrew. That's definitely something we've been discussing amongst ourselves and at EcoBusiness. So 90% of these global GDP may be covered by net zero targets, but emissions keep breaking new records, driven mainly by Asia. Does the net zero let companies off the hook? And do we need to be more stringent? Do we need more stringent regulation and more radical policies to drive genuine decarbonisation in Asia? Michael?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to add to that last question that the Philippines is actually doing quite a lot as well. We do a lot of work with companies in the Philippines, and they've got the BSP Circular 1128, which is directed at banks, as well as BSP Circular 1085. So I'm really impressed at the initiatives that we're seeing at a regulation level there. Coming back to the question around rising global emissions and Asia's role in this.
And do we need more stringent regulation? I mean, we do hear a lot of things are voluntary, but is it time to make things mandatory?
Yeah, and also the net zero. I mean, we need to decarbonize. We need rapid decarbonisation in the global economy, and that includes Asia Pacific. Like I said, we know the number. We need to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to be able to have a high probability of reducing global temperature rise to 2 degrees. There's a lot that needs to be done to do that, and everyone plays their role. And it's been mentioned on this call. It's not a selection of certain companies. It's important that every company plays its part in that emissions reduction. We're able to analyze all companies and their pathways and trajectories to that Paris alignment. And like I say, in some ways, it's very sophisticated, based at the product level, where we're using a sectorial decarbonisation approach. We apply that same analysis to companies in Asia Pacific, and so that's capturing those companies that are generating emissions which are through carbon-intensive homogeneous activities like steel and transport and concrete. And these are industries that need to reduce their emissions, but are also very challenged to reduce their emissions to find alternative ways, as opposed to an assessment which looks generally at those companies that have more heterogeneous carbon intensity profiles. They tend to be the lower carbon intensive industries as well. and we're using more of a greenhouse gas value add approach, so a contraction of emissions. This is the lens through which companies are being assessed, and you can see it on a Cap IQ Pro screen, which is a desktop application that shows the trajectory of the company relative to one of those scenario pathways. So these are tools that will increasingly be used by banks and investors when assessing companies and their alignment. We have alignment tools for companies that are looking through credit risk assessment. So a climate credit risk. At the moment, I don't know who's on this call and what their backgrounds are, but Eric can tell you better than I can, being in that segment. But from my perspective, when I'm working with banks, it's about understanding credit risk. We've been doing credit risk for a long time at S&P. Now, climate change, which has been identified as a material risk, is incorporated into credit risk, and we're looking at that and able to adjust at the financial statement level based on the scenario, the carbon price, and adjusted financial statements. That's our climate credit analytics solution that banks are using. Now, the question around, do we need regulation? Well, put it this way. We've got two choices. Paris alignment, which is what I've talked about, and largely that's been market driven. And so we've seen a reduction or an effort. We've seen an effort from investors, especially from investors as stakeholders, to engage companies on a carbon emission reduction. We've got the Climate Action 100 Plus list. We've got GFANZ, which is $130 trillion of investors coming together with net zero targets. We're seeing these initiatives and this focus. It's a market-driven approach to achieving that Paris alignment. We know what we need to do. If we fail to do it, if the market fails to achieve the emissions reduction at the pace that we need, then there will need to be a policy mechanism that's applied. And that policy mechanism, in its simplest form, could be a carbon price. We know what those carbon prices look like. Using IEA, OECD, and ARENA data, we can determine that that price will be different in developed markets to developing markets, calling out what we talked about earlier, the ability of markets like the Philippines to apply a carbon price compared to the United States. We can measure that carbon price shock on a company based on where its operations are, and determining that carbon price respectively, developed markets versus non-developed. We can also look at what carbon price they're paying today under current regulations, because there are regulations, there are prices on carbon today. There's either carbon markets like there are in China or New Zealand, or there are taxes on fossil fuels like there are in Australia. And so we can take into account that unpriced carbon cost. And we can give that to companies, and they're using that. They're using that in their TCFD reporting. This is quantifying TCFD. This is the next step. A lot of companies are starting their TCFD journey with a governance statement and a strategy statement. The next step will be quantification, because it's quantification that's going to be used by stakeholders in the future to assess the progress that companies made. I mean, sure, there's going to be some people who pull out 5 years of company reports. There are people who have that need. But there are more people that are going to be looking at it through platforms which provide these data points. And so that quantification is becoming a greater factor. And as we quantify it, we're going to see a greater focus on achieving that emissions reduction.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to move to our final question, actually. And this is, we did see a note issued last year about warning boards of companies that it's no longer acceptable to turn a blind eye and not to know what's going on in the company. So how difficult is it for boards and management of the corporates to understand that there will be no profits or even a business in absence of resource support? Is the fact that the current board and C-suite members were trained in the older curricula of profits first and short-termism, preventing them from understanding or acting on the obvious linkages? And I guess some of the issues that we're dealing with, even speaking to companies, is how do you get the boards on board with the ESG and to really understand that the risks extend to them as well? Eric, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think this is a critical piece to crack, because we all know how organizations work, right? The tone from the top, the strategic direction, the willingness to invest in the capability and capacity build in order to be able to execute to a credible and meaningful sustainability transformation. I think that any board that is sitting there pretending that they are not going to be on the hook either today, tomorrow, or next week on delivering a strong and credible sustainability strategy for their shareholders in response to their regulators in order to continue to deliver sustainable alpha. And my language may be strong, is not a board that's worth keeping. Right? That's how strong I feel about this, right? Because especially for us practitioners, and Andrew and I can attest to this, and anyone who runs management within corporations, right? When you have that clarity and support from the board, your entire organization can run at the speed of light. But when your board isn't educated, progressive, brave enough to help lead management and give them the right guidance and resources, that's going to retard their efforts tremendously. So if you look at some of the expectations that's coming up from exchanges, you can see that in Singapore, right? The expectation of a board delivering to their fiduciary duty, and that covers delivering a credible sustainability strategy. SGX requires a board statement, right, within the sustainability report. We see cases of investors suing the board for under-delivering to sustainability expectations. And this is only 2022. You can almost imagine with each passing year that intensity, that aggression, that expectation on boards stepping up is going to increase. And I think that's a really good thing.
So I think just carrot and some stick. Michael, did you want to add to that, or Andrew?
I'll let Andrew go first because he spoke up and I really want to hear.
Sure. Andrew, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's definitely a role to play for the education of the board of directors, but I think directors need to understand the nature of the game has changed, right? In the past, sustainability is reporting, disclosures, reputation, PR, all this sort of stuff. But today, when investment decisions are being made, financing decisions are being made on the basis of ESG disclosures and representation, that is a different responsibility and liability. Right. So I think simply because there's so much more flow of capital, and the finance guys will use it, there's a lot more flow of capital, whether sustainability linked bonds or loans that are discounted premiums. And, it's actually shaping how investors are allocating weightage in their portfolio. It's a totally different ballgame, and they have liabilities and responsibilities. So they need to understand that in that sense. And again, like back to what Eric mentioned, you just need a few high profile, and they're already starting to happen. There's a lot more activism and class action suits on corporates for misrepresentation or poor decisions made in ESG that have a significant impact. Like in Australia, without mentioning company, one of the big energy retailer has had a slam on their share price because of what was felt as wrong decisions made in ESG that has resulted in significant write-downs, right? Several billions of dollars. So you look at it, it's a totally different fiduciary accountability. That is no different from any other aspects of responsibility of a big company.
Yeah, the pressure is on. Michael.
Yeah, Gillian, I just want to add to that. The board sets the strategy, right? Nowadays, that strategy has to include sustainability, and the board has to be informed. They have to be educated on the risks to the organisation, and those risks. When I've got a new definition for risk thanks to the AICD, the Australian Institute of Chartered Directors of Company Directors, and that's riscaro, which they say is the Latin term, which means to dare. So risk is not only about negative implications; it's about opportunities as well. And so that climate change especially will have an impact on a company's future. whether it's the company changing its behavior or competitors through disruption. All of these things need to be taken into account. It's a risk to do nothing as much as it's a risk to invest in a low carbon alternative technology. And companies with boards who are aware are taking this information. They're using measures, they're using KPIs to understand what the assessments are that are being made about ESG, sustainability, and climate change. I've harp on climate change again because, you know, when we're working with companies and boards about ESG strategies, we're highlighting some of the analysis that we find where, you know, two in every 3 companies that we look at, the large companies globally, have at least one asset at high risk to climate change physical risk hazards. Right? So that's potential disruption to their operations, impact on the earnings of the company if that event occurs. When we're looking at it through a carbon pricing perspective, you know, 13% of those companies' earnings are at risk from a carbon price high, carbon price 2030 scenario. So these are things that are real and being called out either directly through guidance by the regulators, the exchanges, as Eric pointed out, or even in corporations law, where directors are liable for material risks that a company is exposed to. There are also measures around health and safety and diversity that companies have to report on in many countries. And these are captured in the ESG metrics that we look at too. So it really is, it's no longer an excuse to say that you're not taking sustainability into account as a company. And if that's still the case, then, you know, beware those directors, because if they're not informed, then they're potentially liable for the risks that occur.
That's some good final words from you all on that issue. Thank you so much. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Michael, for participating in such a lively discussion and answering some pretty tricky questions from our audience. And thank you again to our audience for joining us. I'm going to hand back to Megan, who's going to conclude today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, and also our panel of very distinguished speakers for providing us with such thoughtful and much needed discussion as well on the road ahead for Asian businesses in light of impending regulations and standards to guard against greenwashing, and also the risks involved if businesses do not start taking sustainability into account. We talked about how authenticity from the business standpoint looks like, and how ESG must not just be a pure CSR exercise, but must be addressed by the core business. The critical importance of businesses understanding the relevant disclosure and reporting standards also underpin the conversation, with the biggest challenge being not only the collection of data, but also the standardization and application of data to create credible solutions. We also heard nuggets of quotable quotes from our speakers. What gets measured gets done by Eric. Rubbish in, rubbish out by Andrew, and also the need for data's global standardization, transparency, and impact as well by Michael. I think it's very safe to say that we are walking today from today's session with a deeper understanding of what the future holds for Asian businesses and what needs to be done to implement a sustainability roadmap to prepare for regulations and be authentic about one's business aims. And with that, thank you, speakers, again so much for being a part of this session as we now come to the end of our dialogue. I would like to thank again our audience for that very active participation that we had going on in the chat, for making the time to be here with us this afternoon. I really hope that you found this conversation as enlightening as I did. We are also holding the second in the series of this ESG Uncovered webinar on 18 May, Wednesday at 3 p.m. Singapore time, titled Rising Tide, Adapting to the Changing ESG Regulatory Landscape, where we'll take stock of recent developments in ESG regulation, providing practical takeaways on how to adapt to the changing regulatory climate. So please do join us then as well. Please also do spend a few minutes to give us some feedback on this event from the link that you have seen on the chat box, and also we'll send that by email as well. Don't forget to use our hashtags EB Conversations and EcoBusiness if you are sharing your thoughts on this session via your social networks. On that note, thank you so much once again, Eric, Michael, Andrew, Gillian, and have a great evening ahead.